All right, everybody. Welcome to our discussion of classical Greek warfare. We will learn how the ancient Greeks fought and the weapons they used. We can see this man here is dressed pretty authentically to the time period. He's got his helmet. He has his breastplate, which covers his torso. He's got a round shield in his left hand and a long spear in his right, as well as a short sword as his secondary weapon. He is missing his leg protection. He would wear something like shin guards called greaves that we'll look at in a few minutes, as well as would likely be in sandals. But overall, it is a pretty authentic picture of what a Greek soldier at that time would have looked like. Speaking of Greek soldiers, they were what was called a hoplite. So a hoplite is very simply a Greek soldier from ancient times. If you're wondering why they were called a hoplite, it comes from the Greek word hoplon, meaning weapon. All right, so let's talk a little bit about hoplite equipment. Most city-states required citizens to buy their own equipment, and so not all uniforms look the same. If we look at this picture, we can clearly see the Greeks in battle formation, and yet everybody looks a little bit different. Each shield is unique. They have different clothing styles, different helmets. And the reason was, since everybody was buying their own, they would look something like this, not a uniform like we would think of in later times in warfare. Speaking of those shields, the most important piece of equipment was the shield. And this picture of some reenactors demonstrating Greek warfare, you can see again. Each shield unique. Each person has obviously taken great pride in the design and the art of their own personal shield. The shield was typically made of wood with bronze trim, so metal around the edge. And as we saw, it was circular and concave. In other words, it's not a flat shield, but it's actually curved like a shallow bowl, which allows you to tuck your shoulder inside the curve of the shield. And as we will see, it was held in the left hand and covered from the shoulder to the knees. Had to be held in the left hand, we'll see why in a few minutes. And it's a big shield, so it covers really from the top of the shoulder all the way down to the top of the knees. Point D. If held properly, the shield would protect the right side of the man to the left of the shield. So as we can see these two men standing together, the man on the left, his shield protects his left, but his right side would be exposed. However, it is partially protected by the man next to him. So as you line these hoplites up, the enemy is going to see nothing but a solid wall of shields. We mentioned the hoplite's helmet. Very important piece of equipment, obviously, to keep from being stabbed in the head. Point A, the helmet is solid bronze and heavy, weighs about 5 pounds. Point B, very hot, no ventilation. This was very hard on the soldiers to wear this thing, even though it was so important. And then point C, with this helmet on, it was very hard to see and hear. It's like almost like looking through a tunnel, and so it's a little bit disorienting to not be able to see very well what's going on around you. Point 3, the hoplite also wore armor known as a breastplate to cover his torso. This particular picture is pretty stylized. They certainly weren't all that fancy, but it could look like that. And finally, we mentioned greaves before to protect his shins. Obviously, we don't want to have our legs exposed to the enemy's spear, and so greaves are much like we would think of as shin guards in soccer, perhaps. All right, let's talk weapons a little bit. So point 5, the primary weapon was a spear about 7 to 9 feet long. So this is a long spear. And point A, it was used for stabbing, not throwing. That's why it's so long. So point B, it was carried in the right hand. And we can see this model. The shield is in the left, and then the spear is in the right. And we'll see that the spear is held low, much like this guy's got it. and then stabbing for the upper legs, which was the least protected area. And of course, being so long, the idea is to try to stab the enemy before they can actually get to you. Point 6, hoplites also carried a sword in case their spear broke, or their spear could be dropped, or their hand could be cut. So for whatever reason, if you lose your spear, then you want to pull out your sword and be able to continue the battle with that, although the preference was the spear. All right, let's talk a little bit about point 2, Greek battle strategy. The Greeks fought in a phalanx, and phalanx is really our key word here. This is a battle formation in which the men are shoulder to shoulder and typically about 8 rows deep. So as we can see here, the phalanx is a tight formation. Everybody's shoulder to shoulder, giving the enemy nothing but a solid wall of shields, and then all of the spears sticking out. Then the next row lines up behind that, and usually about 8 rows deep of men. So this advances forward kind of like a rectangle or a box coming toward the enemy. Point 2. The key to a successful phalanx was a word called cohesion, which means staying in a good tight formation and not becoming disordered. This phalanx does not want to separate. They don't want to break apart and become like individuals. Instead, they want to stay shoulder to shoulder, locked together, giving no openings for the enemy to get into the men and in close. In those days, the way they fought, point 3, the armies would line up across from each other on an open plain and then charge at each other. So the idea being we want to stay tight together, solid line of shields, solid line of spears. You can see that we would not want to separate and open up gaps. So there's that word cohesion, right? Staying tight, shoulder to shoulder. Just something to think about. When they charge at each other, if the charge is too fast, the phalanx would lose its cohesion. In other words, the hoplites would be too spread out rather than shoulder to shoulder. So you don't want to run too fast at the enemy and cause our men to separate. On the other hand, point B, if the charge was too slow, it would improve cohesion. They could stay tighter together. But then the enemy phalanx could hit with greater speed and power, smashing your phalanx and driving you back. So the idea is to charge as fast as possible, but not so fast that you begin to separate. Then the battle itself. And you could imagine these two phalanxes charging at each other. So point A, the phalanxes would collide face to face and then begin stabbing with their spears and pushing with their shields. Point B, as you could imagine, the men in the front had to have great courage in order to stay cohesive and shoulder to shoulder, right? To stand in there and not flee or separate or try to back up or move to the side. You want to stay cohesive. The men in the back, what do they do during the battle? Is the men in the back pushed the men in the front with their shields, driving them forward. So this just becomes a physical contest of which side can stay locked together and cohesive and then drive the other side back and defeat them. Victory. Point A, battles were usually short. Point B, one side would break, meaning that they would begin to fall apart. And then point C, if even a few men would break, the phalanx would quickly lose cohesion and collapse. So this battle is not going to last very long. There's going to be a violent collision between the two phalanxes. Whichever one stays in there shoulder to shoulder and doesn't break, they're going to be the winner. But of course, think how hard it would be to stand in there and not break when you see the enemy phalanx charging at you and knowing what's to come. This advanced concept, we're just going to skip for now just because of time concerns. So let's move on. Point 3, we want to talk a little bit about naval warfare. We learned that the Greeks were experts in sailing ships on the Mediterranean Sea. And so, of course, that becomes a way of fighting as well. So, point one, the Greeks also fought with ships called triremes. And so that word trireme is for a Greek battle ship. And we'll talk about why on our next slide. Point A, a trireme, from the word tri, like triangle, means three. So a trireme has 3 decks of oars. Each deck is one above the other. So instead of 1 deck of oars, they would build 3 decks. And that way you have 3 decks of oars instead of just 1. So why so? As you could probably figure out, 3 decks of oars gives 3 times the speed. The idea is instead of just 1 deck rowing, we now have 3 decks rowing, and therefore we can go 3 times faster. Now, why do we want to go so fast? Because of the way triremes fought. So point B, how did triremes fight? One ship would accelerate and ram another. So you want to be able to move and sprint as fast as possible. Not only do you want to be able to maneuver to get out of the way of other ships, but once your ram is lined up, then all 3 decks accelerate and try to ram the other ship and sink it. As it says here, the ram was made of bronze and stuck out just below the waterline. So it's a long pole below the waterline, and then a crew of about 170 oarsmen could skillfully maneuver the trireme into position and then accelerate into the enemy, punching a hole in it. Once you've punched that hole, you then back row as fast as you can, which pulls the ram out, and then hopefully you just watch the enemy ship fill up with water and sink. And so we'll see that sometimes the Greeks fight on land using the phalanx, other times they fight on sea using the trireme, but now with a little bit of background of how they fought should give you some insight when we talk about some of their actual battles ahead. And that concludes our discussion of Greek warfare. So now, once you are finished, let me know, and I'll give you your next assignment. Thanks, everybody.